And in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to just give a bit of an overview of this topic, brain and behavior. I'll just have a go. It's really complex, and the more you read about it, the more you realize that you know very little, and actually other people even know very little as well. So I'll be touching on what sort of approaches we've been traditionally utilizing in explaining how the brain affects the behavior. We'll be talking about some unusual phenomena and extraordinary people, really, that they present in a way that does challenge our understanding of how the brain works. And then I'll be finishing off by some rather philosophical question whether we need our brains to have consciousness, which is quite a provocative question, but we'll see what philosophers got to say, really. Normally, we start this kind of conversation by giving some definitions, but this wouldn't take long because you know what the brain is, and nobody knows what the mind or consciousness is. So it's as simple as that. People will assume that everybody else knows what the mind is, but actually nobody does. There's this guy in America, his name is Dan Siegel. He has done a survey of around 100,000 mental health professionals from all over the world to ask one question: do you know what the mind is? Have you had any training, any even single lecture, what the mind is? And the answer was yes, only in less than 5% of the sample. Similarly, when you ask people what consciousness is, people will say it's the first-person subjective experience. It's actually, and the reason that, or one reason that people can't define consciousness is we tend to define things by referring them to either a higher set, as in a table is a piece of furniture, aggression is a behavior, but consciousness is, we don't know. It's an inner life, an inner world that we experience. We can't really describe it. Or we define things operationally when we say love is when you put up with weaknesses of others. Flying is when you defy gravity. Consciousness is when you do what? And again, you get stuck again. So people have been struggling with those definitions for centuries, really. And you will have come across Descartes' dualism. And he was saying that the brain and mind should be two separate entities. The matter, or the brain, will only be too concerned with certain physical aspects, and everybody can study matter. It's not private. It doesn't have necessarily any personal meaning. It doesn't have qualia, as they call it in philosophy. But actually, when we discuss the mind, then actually mind is in my personal, my private property, and it does have a quality. It does have a meaning. So when I see something in white, what I see now is white, but I don't know if this is exactly what you see, whether this is exactly your experience. So people struggled quite a bit with definitions, and this led to a simplistic, dualistic type view of the world, that it's either matter or something there that you don't know what it is. So it may be a philosophical concept. Some people may say, actually, the mind is just an illusion. It's just this smoke coming out of your exhaust pipe when you drive your car. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a byproduct of the brain. It doesn't actually indicate anything else. Some people say, actually, mind may not even exist. It's just this is a concept that we invented to describe things that we can't study. So people argued that yesterday's soul is today's mind. So people studied this either in a materialistic way, neuroscientific, neuroimaging type way, or the other end of the spectrum is behaviorism and trying to explain and describe things. And this question remains, who's actually causing what if we agree that the mind does exist? We know from brain injury cases and brain diseases that certain areas of the brain, when they get damaged, you may have problems with your behavior, emotions, or memory, etc. So the damage of the matter can lead to problems in the mind. But actually, now it's getting more clear that damage or any change in our behavior, our emotions, will have very permanent impact on the substance of the brain, the structure, the function of the brain, which is demonstrated repeatedly through neuroimaging. So because that dichotomy is not very satisfactory, people try to marry those type of disciplines together. So we hear about social neurosciences, and people may have heard of mirror neurons that were described by an Italian group back in the 80s. Back in the 80s and 90s, they talked about this quite a bit. And what they're saying is, when my motor command neurons start working, when I reach out for something, those motor command neurons will light up, will be in action. But actually, a subset of this motor command neurons will activate when I see you reaching out for things. And this may have some evolutionary and cultural reasons. Somatosensory cortex work in a similar way. So actually, it's a way of sympathizing with others, maybe a way of learning language that has been implicated in the theory of mind. Lots of theories were put around this. So actually, people are saying, perhaps we shouldn't be studying individual brains, we should be studying groups and how we interact with people. Because the general favorable hypothesis nowadays is getting increasingly popular, that the brain will put out the call. So you have something that is coming in your brain because of the genetics, because of your early childhood. But as we react to the environment, as we react to our inner environment or external environment, we accept those kind of concepts, or we reject them, or we modify them. And in that process, our brain will change. So one assumption is that our brain is hardwired not to be hardwired. So the brain does not stay as it is. It's just in a continuous change. And this will lead to something that we need to discuss later around the neuroscience of free will. We hear about contemplative neuroscience and brain plasticity. Certain practices may change our brain structure and function. The guy I mentioned before, Dan Siegel, established that interpersonal neurobiology, trying to get lots of disciplines from humanity and science together to understand the concept of consciousness, and try to address that what is being called in philosophy of mind the hard problem, which is a term coined by an Australian philosopher, David Champlers. Even we hear about neuropolitics. So there are some people in America who will claim that actually by simply doing some brain scans, we can identify what people's political affiliations are. So it's quite interesting. And they say, actually, because we perceive the world differently, and this is how our brain is wired. And they have some convincing data to demonstrate this. Again, we hear about spiritual neurosciences or neurotheology. But there are some even very biological concepts that are not being studied sufficiently, and they are coming out quite evidently in the developing research areas that we read about. So we hear about genetics, and always what comes to mind when we mention genetics is heredity. So it's like inevitabilities, that you have the gene, you'll have to develop certain things. But actually, now it's clear that with epigenetics, there are some environmental factors, some bodily factors, lifestyle, exercise, etc., that can potentially delay the expression of certain genes or affect it otherwise. Microbes. People are studying this area. They say, actually, you think you're a human being, don't you? You are not. You are just a walking colony because of bacteria, virus, protozoa. Because the number of cells inside us, especially inside our guts, will outnumber our human cells by a ratio of 10 to 1, which is quite amazing. And there's some evidence in the mice studies that actually when you try and study conditions similar to autism or multiple sclerosis, depression, using microbes can be useful in therapeutic sense. And even people started to argue, are we becoming too sanitaries, too clean, if you like? So we're not allowing those microbes to do what they are supposed to do, maybe beneficially. Neuroglia is another area that is, again, growing. You may have come across the paper came out last month in Progress in Neurology and Psychiatry, and the title was, Do Not Underestimate Glia. Glial cells are the supportive cells in the brain. So usually the brain consists of neurons and connective tissue. This is what used to be assumed. But now people are talking about the glial cells, those connective tissue cells. They actually communicate with the neurons. And people start to be very critical of this neuron-centric view of the brain. glial cells can be a good target for therapeutics in Alzheimer's disease and other conditions. Oligodendrocyte precursor cells, for example, can interact and they demonstrate bidirectional dialogue with surrounding neurons. Microphagia, the same principle applies, especially with amyloid plagues and things related to Alzheimer's disease pathology. So we'll just touch on some curious phenomena. I'm sure this is something that you will have come across some of those conditions in your clinical practice if you are a clinician. And what I'm going to do really is essentially just to demonstrate the fact or to make the point that maybe assuming that our brain is too simplistic. And you know that now there are books even, you are not your brain. It's not just that. It's much bigger than that. And the interaction with the body and the environment and each other shouldn't be underestimated. I was driving the other day with the children and I saw in the bus one of their films, and it's a horror film, and it says, you wouldn't sleep for 3 weeks. So this was a selling point. So you go and pay for a 3 week of insomnia that people come and spend in hospital to have treatment for. And similarly, the misery. We are very proud. I watched that film, I cried all night, and it's really great. I'll watch it again. Why would we do that? And again, something that is really curious. And you know that people have written books. Why do humans like to cry? What is so special about this kind of negative emotion that we can enjoy? So I'll talk about some somatosensory phenomena and some cognitive phenomena, some phenomena related to body image. So you will have come across synesthesia. This is simply that the senses in the brain get cross-wired. So you can actually have a color for my name. So you can have a color for the days of the week. So just imagine that Monday is blue, Thursday is black, Tuesday is purple. And you have it just in your mind, you see it, you almost see it. Especially numbers and colors. And apparently this is not a very uncommon condition, and it's not really a disease. It's something that is more common in artists and poets and novelists. Because in creativity, we tend to link concepts, metaphors, similes. So let's just try this. How many twos can you see on the chart? Can you see any twos? Yeah. It's not easy, is it? Don't feel bad. When I saw this, I haven't seen any. But actually, somebody with an... Yeah, thanks, Sam. Well done. You may have it, actually. Somebody with synesthesia will see it like this, which would, again, this is how it was, one of the ways that it was studied. It's just standing out, things in a different color. And the argument in fusiform gyrus, you have the color area and the number area cross-wired together. Capgras syndrome. You look at somebody, maybe after a brain injury, and you say to them, yes, you look exactly like my mom, but you're not. You are an imposter. What's going on? So you don't have prosopagnosia, you don't have problem with face blindness, but actually you lost that identity thing. And that has been argued that perhaps some fibers to do with emotionality related to that face, so you don't feel the warmth that you normally feel when you see your partner or your parent initially, but you still retain that identity, that you can recognize the face. But you don't believe that I see that person and I don't feel anything, I don't feel much about them, and it can be a bit heartbreaking to the partner. But actually, then you try to make some explanation up. Perhaps actually it's maybe she's not my mom then. She looks exactly like her. And skin galvanic stimulation being tested, and this sort of hypothesis have been put forward, that you don't feel the whatever emotion, maybe fear, maybe anger with that person. You are blind to seeing. This is what it is about. This is about. So you have intact eyes, intact visual pathway, apart from damaged cortical areas in the occipital area, and that's why you have cortical blindness. So strictly speaking, you can't see. But certain patients will actually be able to guess what is in front of them but the guess is much more often than be explained by chance alone. You move something in the blind side of them, because usually it's unilateral. You move something on the blind side, and they say, I think there's something moving, but it's so unconscious. So they don't acknowledge, it's not in the area of their awareness. They're not aware that they can see. And this has been, again, put forward philosophically to say that actually some sensations can come to us, can affect our behavior, because those people may avoid obstacles, for example, behaviorally. So some of those sensations that can come our way may affect us even if we're not aware of them. Some people may have motion blindness, so they see things in reels. They see things like frames, like cinema frames. They don't see the movement. Simultagnosia, again, people may only see one item at a time, so they can't see the whole picture. They see individual things, but they can't understand the whole picture. And this is usually, again, cortico-parietal boundaries. In achinotopsia, it's quite interesting that people can't sometimes pour water down a jug, because they see the water froze. They can't see the movement of the water coming down. So some aspects with body image. You will have come across things like anorexia nervosa, when people think they're fat and they're not. What happens here, we know that there's a brain map of our body. So people talk about the schema of the body may be different from body image, so what you see may be different from how I perceive myself. But actually, there are some very interesting phenomena that came especially from observing people with amputated legs, or people after a stroke or brain tumor or brain lesion in the parietal lobe. So I don't know if you came across this phenomenon. It's rubber hand syndrome. If you want to look at this guy have this white glove, and then they will have an artificial, they're not tricking the patient or anything, they have an artificial arm, looks similar, and you synchronize them. So what tends to happen is you start to get feelings from the artificial arm that's not even connected to your body at all. And look what's going to happen on this hand, the right hand, obviously. It's quite interesting, isn't it? And this opened up quite a bit of understanding when we think of phantom limbs, for example. Phantom limb, when you have a leg amputated or an arm amputated, but you feel it. It's there. Even you can feel pressure on it. You may have involuntary movements. You may have a spasm in your hand that no longer exists. So people will have that very unusual experience, and they have it by the centimeter. They know it's there. Till that, they can even feel their fingers on the stump, and the thumb and fingers in the stump after an above elbow amputation, for example. So what people invented was they tried this mirror box, and they tried to trick the brain. Because what tends to happen, again, this is the hypothesis, or one assumption, is the brain keeps giving stimuli to this amputated arm, and the arm keeps clenching and becomes really spastic, and there is no feedback to say, that's enough, we don't want more spasm, more contraction. But actually what happens here is they will tell people that actually, can you see in the mirror, this is the amputated arm, but this is the intact arm. Just think of this as your other arm. And they get convinced, and the pain relieves after a number of sessions. May not be too many sessions of doing this. I talked about mirror neurons as well, and it's quite amazing because people will have an amputated phantom limb, or a painful phantom limb, and when you massage the person sitting in front of them, they may get relieved. And this is how the mirror box works.
One therapy is mirror therapy. The amputee put a mirror opposite their sound leg, so that when they look down, it looks as if they have two legs.
After a parietal lobe lesion, you may have those very bizarre phenomena as well, as somatognosia, which is you actually deny the fact that you have an arm or a leg. You don't believe that it's there. You don't acknowledge it at all. I don't know where my arm is. And people start looking under the beds. and try to find their arm. And then we say, what is this? No, they don't believe that this is theirs. There was a patient who kept pouring very hot water just to reassure himself that it's still there. If you ask, where is it? They look over their shoulder. More bizarrely, people may have this other phenomenon, somatoparaphrenia, which is they say, okay, yes, this is an arm, I found it, but it's not mine. It's my mum's, or it's the examiner, which again, another very interesting phenomenon. People may have xenomelia, which is the opposite. It's like negative phantom limb, if you like. So they feel that one arm or one leg, it doesn't belong to them. It's not mine. And I'm angry with it. It's not, I don't know why it's following me everywhere I go. It's not mine. And although it can sound a bit amusing, you can imagine how horrible it is for the patient and for the doctor who's asked to chop it off. Because obviously, there are lots of legal and medical legal and ethical implications. But actually, I hear that it's licensed, this kind of surgery in America. Because actually, you would think that people wouldn't have a relief. They would. Normally, they would have a relief. Some very few percentage will have shifting of symptoms, but usually patients, they say, actually up until like 4.5 centimeter down my shoulder, this bit is not mine. And even when you touched, you can't stimulate the somatosensory cortex in the brain. It's actually not theirs. It's just attached there. Abdominophilia is a similar symptom, but it has some sexual connotation. People will be aroused by their image with no leg or limb or arm. Alien limb syndrome, again, people will have, usually on the left side because it's a right parietal lesion, and this is doing its own thing. So I'm just trying to fasten my button, and this will unfasten them. And you watch this kind of videos, and it's really bizarre. People will be vacated from nursing homes because they're touching people inappropriately. They go and speak to the examiner. During the examination, they may reach for the examiner's pocket and get something out, and they say it's out of their control. They can't control it. I'm sure you'll be familiar with this as well. You can see when people are asked, after parietal lobe lesion as well, asked to draw a diagram, even from memory, they will ignore the left side of the object. Not just that, they also overemphasize the right side. And this can present with behavior problems. People may be aggressive because they see things suddenly coming to them from the wrong side, and they appear in their visual field. It's not a visual field defect, but it's the as John was saying, you are not aware of it. It's an attentional thing. Some cognitive phenomena, quite interesting as well, is the false memory syndrome. False memory syndrome is about people's lives revolving around a memory that is not true. And you will have come across things like recovered memory. Some psychotherapy techniques have been blamed for this, accurately or inaccurately, because during the sessions, if they are doing dream interpretation, imagination, this kind of work, people may start believing that they have been sexually abused as children, they have been exposed to some satanic rituals, and they get really, really upset. And this led to some medical legal cases, and it has been taken with caution. But the message in this really is our memory is not a tape recorder. Some of our memories never existed, which is frightening when you think about it. So things that you think, I remember that teacher, and I remember that prize when I won in year 3 as a child. It may have never happened. And this is what those philosophers and psychologists are trying to prove. And it's becoming a serious problem when people talked about the eyewitness memory. Before I touch on the eyewitness memory, the false memory, some people say it may be a good thing that anybody can manipulate the memory. I know it sounds a bit negative, so it's like it's open to suggestibility and things, but actually it could be used therapeutically. Some people argue that actually if you implant a memory in your children's brain, that eating a pizza every day is not a good idea, because actually you were sick when you were 2, and we took you to hospital, etc., etc. Some people actually advocate this, that you go out and lie to your children. And when they were criticized and they were reminded of the ethical aspect to this or non-ethical aspect of this, they just answered, "Hello, Santa Claus." And they say, okay, you do that every day, you do it when you talk to your children about tooth fairy, etc. The idea is when you implant memories, like the example I gave, people may behave differently. And this may be a way of addressing childhood obesity, and you are saving them from future diabetes, strokes, etc., etc. But obviously, it's very, very controversial. But apparently, you can manipulate memory. If I ask you, have you seen that accident in the on TV a couple of weeks ago? Did you see the car smashing? If I use a verb like hit, you may give an answer that's different from if I use a verb like smash. So you will overestimate the speed, you may see broken glass, or you may recall broken glass in the picture that it may have not been there. So suggestibility is there, and that's why eyewitness memory became a big thing. There is a non-profit organization in the States called Innocence Project. Started in the 90s, it's a government thing. What they're trying to do is to use the DNA technology to help people who are wrongly convicted in prison. So they managed to get over 300 people since then out of prison because they were wrongly convicted. About 75% of those people were convicted on the basis of false witness account. And actually, it wasn't a lie. The witness actually believed that this was the perpetrator. So it is quite an interesting concept, and one wonders, is this just being explained by the brain anatomy, or is there something else that is playing up in here? The Libet experience, Benjamin Libet in the 80s undertook this experience. Arguably, this is the most sort of famous experience in the field of consciousness and brain philosophy, philosophy of mind. What they've done is they had subjects, and this is about free will, by the way. You have subjects sitting there, and that the person will be asked to look at the timer, and they can wiggle their finger or the rest. But once they decide that they're going to do that, they need to press the button. And there is a timer, as I said, so they record that as well. And the amazing outcome was that actually there is a readiness potential in the brain because they had EEG recording during the test. This was there. There were some electrical changes in the brain about several hundred milliseconds before the conscious decision was made. And people started to use this as an evidence of the absence of free will. They say, if you actually have a free will by definition, you have a conscious decision. If this happened before awareness, even if you say, okay, it happened related to the consciousness, but it was before I'm aware of the decision, then it is not, we can't argue then that consciousness is leading to that decision. Lots and lots of, hundreds of papers written about this, and a number of full books written about this experiment. What Libet eventually said, actually, it may be that the unconscious brain is in operation, and making the decision on your behalf based on your habits and based on your previous conceptions and things like that. But at the very last minute, very last millisecond, you can have, or your consciousness have the right to veto that action. So consciousness is not about free will, it's about free want. So they are saying that it's a bit, an analogy that Libet gave, it's a bit like a golfer's club. You can swing it a bit, and then before they hit the ball, this is the time when you can make that final decision. It is quite an interesting concept because people argued against it, and people said actually Libet didn't take into account the time when the impulses fly within the visual pathway. But actually, this was replicated in 2008, and people said it's up to 7 seconds before the decision was made. You can still detect some brain activity. And this would lead to that question. Why do we all know what to choose for lunch now? What's the healthy option? But we don't do it. We all know how much alcohol we should drink on a Friday night, but we don't do it. Why is that the case? And it has been argued that it is the case because this is how we're training our brain. And we have to focus on our unconscious brain. And this is what regulates the environment, what regulates organizations and nations, our habits, our attitudes. That's why in education we hear about knowledge and skills, but now there's much more emphasis on the third dimension, that's attitude. and inclinations. What should you do in a certain situation? So unless we have, and this may be an answer to the free will problem. We can have a free will to train our brain subconsciously or unconsciously, if you like, and this is something that we can do, but it gets really, really difficult if you are impulsive, if you have less time between the urge to do something and the execution of the action. Some people said that Libet only tested movements, and it's not the same as thinking or planning or sequencing or problem solving. When we are at the medical school, people of my age, cerebellum is always being presented as an organ of motor control, motor regulation. But actually now we know. So it's just a nice illustration of how limited our knowledge are, because this is what we believed back in the 80s. There wasn't any talk about cerebellum being involved in personality changes or impulsivity or language or visuospatial skills. But now we know that it is the cerebellar circuits that is affected in this kind of conditions. Another one, interesting one that is quite attractive to the media, when people get out of a brain injury and they start talking a foreign accent they've never talked in before. Two quick examples of how our brain can be modulated based on the unconscious brain and our habits. London taxi drivers, again, it's a famous experiment where it is shown that they have a bigger or more pronounced hippocampal gyrus. This is a coronal section of an MRI, T1 weighted image, and this is the hippocampal gyrus. And it is bigger than you would expect normally in normal controls. And simply the argument is the taxi drivers in London, they have to memorize all those road maps, and this can lead to structural change in the brain. Similarly, meditation, the areas that are responsible for compassion can permanently change with certain practices. The other direction will be people with temporal lobe epilepsy may have very intense mystical experience. They experience God or a divine entity. They may see things. They may believe they are God when there's some epileptic activity taking place in the temporal lobe. Some unusual people, you will Savant syndrome. This guy has got an autism. He can learn a language a new language, like Icelandic language, which is apparently very difficult, in 1 week. He can recite over 2,000 digits by reading them once, and he will do it in order, and he's done that in front of a live audience. But what is interesting is you can have this kind of Savant syndrome, acquired Savant syndrome, after brain injury. So people may become talented mathematicians. They see things differently in geometric language and geometric dimensions, and they may become musical geniuses. There was this guy who jumped in the shallow end of the swimming pool after the brain injury. He just realized that he can do all sorts of 6 to 7 instruments, musical instruments. He can play very, very well, and he's not even able to read the note. But obviously, it is attached with some other problems in terms of headache and hearing loss, etc. This is somebody with prosopagnosia. You choke close. This may look like a picture. Sorry, it may look like a photograph, but it isn't. It's something that he painted. What he does is he's not able to recognize faces because they move around, which is not typical of prosopagnosia. But actually, he said that I look at my friends, and then when they do this, it's like a new person. Then they move again, it's a new person. So they flatten them out and do it in 2Ds as opposed to 3D, and then he is able to recognize them. So he will start with grids. He will divide the picture into squares, and this is a very close-up. And when you move out, and it will become something like this. If you are blind, you cannot see. Apparently, it's not true. So, if you are blind, you can't stimulate your visual cortex. Again, apparently, this is not true. This guy proved us wrong in this because he was able to have his occipital cortex stimulated, the visual area, simply by echolocation. So he will click And he will find his way around by doing this. Let's watch that together.
Going to be...
They call me the real-life Batman. My claim to fame is that I click. There's a lot of emphasis on helping the blind in this sort of charitable way. We don't really see it as a charitable thing. We see it as just supporting citizens of society to be effective citizens. Our emphasis is in how the blind can help the world. So blind people who are able to step up to the plate choose how and what they want to achieve. They've developed themselves into something, and they've developed the world around them into something. And that is a process that is applicable to everyone.
So this is about brain plasticity and the fact that we can rewire our brain through our interaction with people, our interaction with the outside world, our bodies, our way of thinking. Lastly, I'll just finish this off quickly. Very bizarre phenomena that people reported. Some people have severe dementia. They may have recovery of lost consciousness, that they lost consciousness for ages, not necessarily comatose, lost consciousness, I think like they can't communicate, they can't talk to people, or may have actually lost consciousness literally, in the neurological sense. Then they can become lucid and they talk for hours maybe, or even days before they die. And this can't be explained easily. Memories of past life, there are children have been interviewed, they have memories of them living before, and they have birthmarks explaining how they died. And again, this is quite bizarre, but people who are undertaking this kind of research are actually scientists and psychiatrists and neurologists. Telepathy, people talk about communication with even their pets and their other distant family members from in different countries. Near-death experience, they can see the resuscitation equipment. Even you are blind, you can do that apparently, and this has been reported in hundreds of people. Complex consciousness with minimal brain, this is the provocative bet. Is your brain really necessary? This is a professor in neurology, I think pediatric neurology, has a center had a center in Sheffield for spina bifida and hydrocephalus. And what he's saying, actually, some of his patients are very highly functioning socially and academically, and what happens is when they do a scan, they see this. You are supposed to have this big CSF in the lateral ventricles, and it's now this. So this is the brain substance. This is the normal, and this is now the brain substance, and this is just like an empty skull. And you also, this is another picture here, same person. This is the math graduate whose IQ is 126. You come across these kind of cases in the media. And this was in BMJ, a lorry driver being scanned after brain injury. This is not caused by brain injury, and he hardly have any frontal or temporal lobe, just remnants of those. And I'll finish by this word. Maybe it's time to think of humanities and science as allies. And because actually you hear people talking from the scientific point of view or the philosophical point of view, and they can be quite dismissive of each other, or even sarcastic of each other's approaches. So it may be time that we have a more holistic view around the world and how the brain works. Thank you very much.